So maybe to start off, if you want to share with our audience a little bit of your background, and then we can get started into the chat.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you for your passion and motivation and all that you do for not only young people, but I think the world at large. My name is Hazami, as was mentioned, and I am a confused human that has spent my life trying to figure out how to make an impact. And for any of you in the impact space, you know that it's about making mistakes, iterating, reiterating, and then the entire time you're like, what do I actually do with my life? And that's the question my parents ask all the time. But I am the founder of the Humanity Lab Foundation, of which one of the programs is the Global People's Summit. And what we have put together is the first 100% online conversation, really looking to connect people all over the world doing fantastic things every single day of their lives into opportunities to make big scale impact and to be heard by decision makers. And so a lot of it is really about disrupting the status quo. When we keep hearing people need to do more, the reality is people are doing a lot of fantastic work every single day all over the world, but there's not really a chance for these people to connect to each other, to get the support that they need to grow in their impact. But also, there's a massive silo that exists between industries and sectors, whether it's governments working in a bubble, corporations working in a bubble, youth organizations working in a bubble. And what we're trying to do is to figure out how do we disrupt that and create a shared value ecosystem.
So looking at that and kind of delving back a little bit further, can you kind of explain how you got started? Because you've done a lot, but you've done a lot and you've made your way into the United Nations, and that's a whole other world in itself in terms of how do you, I think a lot of individuals are looking at, when we look at change, we think systemic change. We think, how do we move some of these big issues? And a lot of that comes down to policy, government, and other elements. And how can individuals make an impact in that space?
I mean, that's, I think, a really good question, because I think for a lot of the work I do is on the ground. And I think so many people are like, I don't really matter. I can't make much of a difference from where I'm at. And the reality is, when I used to work at the UN, people would say, the United Nations needs to do blank. The United Nations is not this static thing. The United Nations is all of you. It's your governments that are there, that are elected by you, whether you choose to vote or not, and decisions that are made on the ground in communities every single day impact local politics, which then impacts national politics, which then impacts regional politics, and all of that, in essence, is what comes together at the UN. And a big misconception of the UN, too, there are many agencies that belong to the UN system, and so every entity acts as this individual entity within this larger structure. So the reality is, a lot of times people don't realize how much power they actually do have in not only shaping conversations on a local level, but being advocates for issues, pressuring the right stakeholders to then have to take action. Because you know what? If a politician doesn't represent you in your local community, they're also not going to represent you well on a global stage, right? And it's all connected. And so the work and how I got into my work, I'm half Syrian, half Palestinian. So I grew up kind of being exposed to conflict and instability politically, socially, economically from a very young age. Migrated to the United States, and I had the beautiful fortune of getting wiped out by Hurricane Katrina. So my family lost everything. Here we come, seeking this American dream, and got to see injustice and how kind of ineffective systems work in aid allocation, humanitarian support, and distribution. You would think that I saw more of that in Syria. No, I actually saw worse political response systems in the United States after Hurricane Katrina. And the reason I say that is that's what unlocked that really strong desire for me to realize that change happens on a local level. And the reality after Katrina, post-Katrina, was it doesn't matter what color your skin is, what you look like, what your background is. Loss is loss. Disaster is disaster. Humanitarian affairs is humanitarian affairs. And so who are we to politic on who receives aid and who doesn't? What issues we should be outraged about and which ones we shouldn't? Which ones should get media attention versus which ones don't? And that became just a personal vendetta I had, because here I was, an American now, national, but at the time, I'm a migrant who's a Muslim woman from a country that most people only hear about when it comes to terrorism, war, especially if you look at the Palestinian side, there's tons of misinformation there. And so I never liked politics, because I think politics strips us of our humanity. I care more about the humanity behind it. And the reality is, whatever cause you care about or whatever side of the issue, whatever the issue is, at the end of the day, it's people that want to live lives of dignity and have kind of affordable things that they can afford and have kind of access to opportunity, no matter what your cause is. And that's where I started to really get into the people part of what I thought was missing from a lot of the humanitarian and advocacy work, which I still say to this day, in the process of servicing humanity, we've lost our own. And I think even if you look at the most socially good initiatives around the world, a lot of them lack humanity, right? How competitive are your NGOs? And real talk, you don't have to raise your hand, I'm not like gonna judge you, but your NGOs, like honestly, there's more cutthroat, dirty politics that happens in the NGO fundraising world than in some of the corporations and governments I've worked in. So I think it's important for us to challenge ourselves and to think about what is change and how do we make it happen. And that's literally what led me to work at the UN. As I became an activist, started mobilizing people in my community to start caring about issues that impacted us. And through that kind of got more visibility for my work. And I think somebody early on the panel talked about authenticity.
Yes.
And I think it was really just being able to speak for myself. Because every time disasters happen, people are like, can you speak on behalf of all Muslim people or all women in the world? I'm like, no, absolutely not. I can speak on behalf of me. And I think, again, the reality behind activism is so many times we also kind of take causes and the banners and run with them, and there's also failure in that, and so.
Well, there's a fine line of separating, because to your point, you can lose yourself in that too, when you can get super passionate, and then you think when people aren't attaching to the cause, they're not attaching to you, so it can go both ways. What I'm hearing from you is grounds are creating a sense of commonality, and also empathy, and I really liked the first part of your story when you were sharing how until you saw it and experienced it, that's what lit up the spark in you for all the injustices you were experiencing. So I wonder, with that perspective, that to kind of answer a question on individuals who are looking for systemic change, and like, I just see all the, I just kind of have this vision of when we're looking at governments, like governments need to do this and that, and like, they're not listening to me and all these things, that maybe a step forward is actually first creating a ground where they can experience the challenges that we're trying to move changes or policies on. So maybe it's more so creating environments and systems where where individuals of power and decision can be exposed to the experiences that we're trying to solve, or the challenges and gaps. So with that and building on that, you, after doing this work, you have gone now and you've worked in the United Nations, and I want to just underscore that, to your point, it's not like you grew up being wanting to be a politician or into policy. You were essentially just sharing your voice, turned into an activist, voicing that, and found your way into positions of power or influence within a system. And I think that's a lesson anyone can take. Really, at the end of the day, it starts with being clear on what you're passionate about, sharing that with probably as many people as you can and I've learned in my own experience, by sharing that with many people, eventually you find the right people, the right ears to hear what you're saying that can help show you that way. So my question for you would be, once you get to those positions, and when you're in those roles, what would be the next step to being able to overcome some of these, what you would say, like you said, the politics within the systems that are clouding or distracting from the original mission of serving humanity?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very big, complex question. After that, I'll solve how to solve all the world's problems.
We're just here. You might as well.
Yeah, no, I think that there's a few things I just want to pick up on from what you said. I think what I constantly feel frustrated by is we're creating new things. Yeah. The world does not have a shortage of clutter. I mean, like, literally, everyone will tell you they have the solution, not a solution, the solution to ending poverty. So I asked them, define poverty. They're like, oh, all people should have an income. What is income, right? So most people care. I don't take that away from anybody, but what do they care about? And have they taken the time to actually unpack the complexity of the global development challenges? And when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, and I actually have a masterclass later this afternoon, I'm gonna go into that, but under each of those goals, there's targets and indicators. How many of you have actually looked into what each of these goals that you've probably seen the icons of actually mean? Like, you can be okay, raise your hand, it's fine. We're not gonna judge everyone who didn't. Actually, I am
and
secretly.
Put it on, you can thumbs up it online if you're watching via online.
So the reality behind it is we care, But do we care enough to do the homework that we need to do to create ecosystems for change and impact? And that's where I think a lot of times people feel frustrated because they feel so either overwhelmed and thus become apathetic because they're like, I can't really do anything, or then they burn out in the humanitarian. We've talked about this a lot on a personal level. In the humanitarian and kind of social good space is also very extreme because everyone wants to solve everything in isolation of one another. And guess what? You're creating another problem, which is a whole nother conversation. And so for me, I think the most important thing is for people to kind of take a step back and really try to understand what spaces they're trying to actually make an impact in, and really try to do ecosystem mappings. And as silly and as technical as that is, it's really not. Which voices are not being included in the conversation? How do we actually figure out how to include those voices? What does change actually look like? How do I talk to people that don't believe in my vision of change? How do we create coalitions for impact?
Just on that point, that's actually a fantastic technique and strategy. When you are looking to articulate or even refine your vision, actually going to, I wouldn't say like a naysayer or someone who does not believe in it is a perfect practice on being very clear on your value proposition or what you're trying to solve. Because if you can explain it to someone who doesn't know or believe in it yet and get them to believe in it, that's when you know that you have found your vision, or like kind of that compass, so to speak, of your passion. So I really like that technique, and I found that you always hear that you want to build yourself and surround yourself with a positive network of people, and I totally believe that you are the sum of your network and those you work with. But I have found my greatest lessons in growth as an entrepreneur been from coming across confrontation and areas of resistance and figuring out how to move past that resistance.
What I think it's something important to say too is like, do you guys know what the most watched video types on YouTube are? Cat videos and makeup tutorials. Real talk. There are amazing people that are doing fantastic work that can't figure out how to crack the AI behind how to make a video go viral. And that's where partnerships become important, because those that have a platform should have a responsibility, supposedly, if we believe we're part of a shared value ecosystem, to do something. Production is one of the most expensive things I've ever had to do as a professional. Getting a video produced in the field of a crisis will cost you, a good production will cost you insane amounts of thousands of dollars. I can feed an entire village for a few $100s. Like, again, put it into perspective. But if I can't get the video to tell the story as to why I need to feed these X communities over here, you're not going to start to create big scale impact. And the problem is we talk about scale. Everything is scale, right? It's like, let's do this and scale and scale and scale. Scale requires either a ton of marketing dollars, if you look at kind of how social media also works, or it requires your capacity to tell your story. The most inspiring, amazing human beings I know that are working on the front lines don't know how to tweet, don't know how to tell their stories. You know why? Because they're day in and day out, knees and hands in the mud, getting stuff done that matters, right? They're not sitting there being like, hold on, let me tweet this, selfie. It's not how the world works. And in most communities, do you know what percent of the world does not have access to the internet? Yeah, more than half of the world's population does not have access to the internet. So again, like, we have to challenge ourselves with our privilege. And that's that. I always ask myself to do a privilege index every time I'm going there. All of you are here, great, you have privilege. It starts by acknowledging your privilege. I come from a community, half my family doesn't even have a passport because my country is not recognized, right? The other half are living as refugees without work permits or the capacity to actually do anything. And again, I'm half Syrian, half Palestinian. So you start to then think about, well, they're all doctors and engineers and lawyers and fantastic people with great ways and great visions on how to solve local problems because they've lived the consequences of failed policy. But those people are not in this room, and they never will be. And that's where I think the accountability of young people that have the capacity to mobilize people, that have access to these structures and systems, starts to push us to think about, again, shared value. What does shared value start to mean? But on the other hand, I want to challenge my own point by saying we also burden people that have that privilege, right? So it's like the shame thing is real, and I call it victim Olympics, right? So it's like, how dare you post about that issue? Do you know that there are 30 more other people over here that have this problem too? And so the culture of change is also like really confusing to a lot of people. And I think I just say that to say that there are so many ways that we can start to impact big scale systems, that the biggest and start point should be really to assess our individual selves, really to challenge our assumption of how change needs to happen, and to start thinking about how do you do what you can do with the resources that you have in light of kind of the larger vision of change, and then how do you build partnerships to enable the rest to happen without feeling like you have to create a parallel initiative or an organization?
Well, that's what I really love about that is at the end of the day, change starts with us, and that's actually been a theme in a lot of conversations, even today in the programming, is the fact that every movement actually starts with one person who just has the conviction to see that through. And if we can change, we do kind of think, okay, how do I create change? Let's pick somewhere that's popular in the media or something and focus on that as opposed to looking at our own backyard. Like we think hunger only happens in countries outside of, let's say we're in the global north right now and we think, okay, well we might need to look at developing countries to help that. But there's hunger right now in our backyards, in our local communities. There's people homeless everywhere. Those are universal problems. And if we start with our communities and doing just small things to become those local kind of humanitarians, those stories, those impact matter. And I would say then for the platforms, for the ones who have the social media platforms, to your point, maybe emphasizing and focusing a little bit more on shining a spotlight to initiatives like that when they have the ability to do so.
I think we might be low on time, but I want to just pick up on one point, which I think is really important. And again, a lot of my work, I consider myself a social innovator. So I look at society as it is and try to imagine how it can be and figure out how do we get there. So all of my work falls within that category. But you brought something really important up. My insane frustration when I first moved to America was how we were going to do all these women empowerment programs in the developing world, specifically Muslim majority countries. And I used to work a lot with, do a lot of stuff with state and various other entities. And I literally had to turn around and say, do you realize that we are having a conversation about whether or not America is ready for a woman president? Whereas there are some countries, Muslim majority countries, that have had women prime ministers and women in parliament and gender equity in political positions for ages. And our media cycles were literally, can Hillary Clinton, will America allow a woman to be president? And it was shocking. And then also, we talk about restrictive communities and restrictive societies. There are more women entrepreneurs popping out of Saudi Arabia, like Reality Check, than Silicon Valley in the United States. And so when you start to then question like your assumptions of what change starts to look like, my biggest, again, disconnect in the States is I moved to Mississippi. When I moved to Boston, and I went to school recently in Boston and New York and Washington, and everyone was talking about this vision of America, I'm like, I lived in a whole nother America. Do you guys want to go talk about that, where we're still arguing whether a Confederate flag should be on our national flag or on our state flag, which for me was shocking coming to the States, thinking that was all kind of things of the past. So I think you're absolutely right. My biggest frustration, I think, in the social impact space, which leads me to do what I do now, which is more kind of public speaking and advocacy, getting more people to start thinking about what they care about, why, and how they're going to do something about it, is because so many times people care, but they actually don't know what they care about. And they associate their outrage to things that aren't necessarily a reality. Like, I want to liberate all Muslim women of blank, right? Great, there's a lot of problems, and I say this because it's personal to me. There's a lot of realities of Washington, D.C. on K Street, I don't know how many of you guys are from Washington, is a massive human trafficking community, and we don't hear about it. We just see suited, amazing politicians walking around. Google it. Google the busts that happen in big cities in America and how it's silenced, literally. And on top of it, again, really thinking about how are we telling the wrong stories and making people outraged by stuff that they feel is so untouchable, rather than realizing that in the United States, domestic violence, 1 in 3, is it 1 in 3 women? I don't know the actual updated stat, but it's appalling. Whatever the stat is domestically abused. That's here in the States. So great. Our foster system is broken. It's actually really horrible.
I think it's at the like you said, it's about perspective. Yes. Or lack of perspective in the sense that, and I think social media aggravates this, because what happens with social media is, depending on who you follow, you get in their bubble, in their space. So if everyone's kind of confirming your assumptions and your perspectives, you think the world thinks this as well. And the reality is, it could be the 100 or 1,000 or 100,000, whoever it is, in your following, and then the millions of others in the world have a whole different experience and perspective similarly on the same issue. That's actually what inspired me to do a lot of the youth work. Is I gained perspective through traveling and meeting with international groups of young people. And to sit in a room, my favorite part is to sit in a room and you're talking about something like women's rights or climate change, and you're hearing, well, in our small island state, we're doing this X, Y, and Z for climate change. And then, well, in Asia, we're doing X. And in North America, we're doing Y. And I think when you bring those perspectives together and you have them all seated at a table, that's when you get the nexus. That's when you start to see change happen, when you bridge those gaps. And I think that's perfect theme between Global People Summit and Bridging the Gap is really that idea of multi-sector, multi-perspective conversations to burst those bubbles that we all are in. Because as much as we try, we all are in some sort of bubble, whether it's your local bubble, your national bubble, like there's always going to be some sort of lens that you're seeing the world through that someone else isn't going to have.
And I want to say, I mean, I think I'm a realist when it comes to talking about this stuff, and it's not because I'm Debbie the Downer or negative. To the contrary, unpacking that makes me so damn optimistic. There are so many fantastic people all over the world that if given an opportunity to join and to activate, would. Mm-hmm. They're just dwarfed out by the clutter. And so, and all of us in some way are clutter. And I don't mean that in a condescending or negative way, but at some point just being really aware of kind of our privilege and our capacity to make a change is a huge part of the work that we're doing and I'm doing, specifically with really kind of activating people to realize, again, what does change look like, but what do I look like in that change narrative? And again, like, ask yourselves, how many of you have actually thought about your capacity to actually make a change? Really kind of thinking, and to people watching online too, is really thinking about, like, how many times have you sat there so frustrated being like, I need to solve all of these problems? It happens all the time, and I do it myself. But it's really about then being able to connect and plug into other communities and other ecosystems to realize that change is happening, it's gradual, but we do also need outrage, right? You need to be able to step up and speak up, and that comes with risk. And some of us take on more risk than others, and that is a fact. You know, and I think that's where partnerships and allyships become extremely important, because the reality is there are consequences for people saying, I believe blank, if you look like the other in a workspace. Fill in the blank. That could be any issue, right? And so allyships become super important, because how do we start to move the needle forward? And I always say that with the gender equity conversation. We keep making gender equity, and this is generalized, but I think most of you would probably agree, as men versus women. Gender equity is about us. Regardless of how you identify, it's about a humanity of giving everybody equitable access. And I really differentiate between equity and equality, because I think equality has a different connotation, but equity also is that we are vested stakeholders in this equality process. And so they are different in the sense of, you know, how we're talking about like one-to-one. That's what we would consider equality, right? Equity is more really thinking about how do we make sure these people are represented, even if it means that we have to shift the playing field a little bit and figure out how to make sure their voices are heard. But again, it's people that shape the systems. And it's always this chicken or an egg where people say, the system sucks. Well, I hate to break it to you. When we talk about society is, you know, I keep saying it, everyone's like, society's so dark. You are society. Like, when did we lose our individual agency? And again, like, I think we strip too much of our power when we're unable to kind of step into the reality of the world in which we live. And maybe it means I can't make change. I'm not capable, I have priorities, and that's great. Recognize that and figure out how you can activate and support someone else who can, versus everybody feeling like they have to be the next frontier of change.
I really like that, because that's a really great summary point, because when we look at, someone gave me this advice actually once, is I had a mentor, and I said, we were talking about his best advice he had or something, and he told me, he's like, he said, if I tell you anything, don't ask others to be like you. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, everyone is different. I know individuals who have sailed around the world. Do you want to be in a tiny boat and go through extreme conditions to go around the world? Not everyone's cut out to do that or wouldn't find that enjoyable. And it's the type of thing that everyone has different talents and strengths and different personalities. So telling you to be like me when I have a different mix of maybe I will take, I will take on more risk than maybe someone who's risk averse. I will go head first and jump out of a plane before I figure out if my parachute works. Other people will not do that. Everyone is different. And to your point, I really like the fact that if you don't have to be the front line. You don't have to be the one going to Bolivia during the fires and being on the ground. You can support in your backyard right now doing other things that you are capable of. Maybe you're super good at budgeting and finance and you can help with the fundraising component, or maybe you're great at video and you can help, or even you have a social media following and you want to mobilize people to know about the cause to get into it. I really like that point of the fact that there's always something someone can do, and it doesn't have to be one way.
And on that point, I know we're out of time, but on that point, all of you right now, go to your online, whatever it is, platforms, and tell people to join the conversation using the hashtag.
That's one thing you can do
because
right
all
now.
of you have people in your community, and we want them all to hear this. So hashtag that thing.
BTG to youth.
Yes, do it. All right, I'll be back later, but I think I'm being evicted off the stage.
Thank
All right,
you. Thank you.